Welcome to the third part of our series on perspectives on the war in Ukraine. Previously, we heard about the economic impacts of the Russian invasion and the continued assault of Russian forces on Ukraine by air and land forces, and then about the significance of this war for the neighboring NATO countries and the struggles over authoritarianism versus democracy. Today, we move on to a broader historical view of the European land empires that have been the ambition of not only Russia, but of Germany. Our speaker is John Connelly, who is Sidney Hellman Ehrman Professor of European History. He holds a bachelor's degree in international relations from Georgetown, an MA in Russian and Eastern European Studies from Michigan, and an MA and PhD in history from Harvard. Professor Connelly specialized in modern East and Central European political and social history, but has also researched and written on comparative education, history of nationalism and racism, and the history of Catholicism. In addition to publishing numerous articles and reviews and co-edited volumes, I'd like to mention his 3 books: Captive University, The Sovietization of East German, Czech, and Polish Higher Education, 1945 to 56, published in 2000, and winner of the George L. Beer Prize of the American Historical Association. From Enemy to Brother, The Revolution in Catholic Teaching on the Jews, 2012, winner of the John Gilmari Shea Book Prize of the American Catholic Historical Association. And the most recent book from 2020, From Peoples into Nations, A History of Eastern Europe. Professor Connelly has also been a member of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton and served on the editorial board of several journals related to European and Eastern European, Central European history. I'm delighted to welcome him here today to speak to us on Europe's 2 land empires. Go ahead.
So thank you. I have the floor. So maybe briefly, if you could please show the first slide. Thank you. So this is where I'm going to start and where I'm going to go today. First, talk about Ukraine as part of a region between Germany and Russia, which shares the fate of the nations between Germany and Russia. Second, I'm going to talk about Germany and Russia as peculiar kinds of empires, land empires. Third, then I'm going to wonder about sort of the other form of political rule that we're familiar with other than empire, namely the nation state. And I'll explain why I'm doing that when I get there. And then I'm going to focus on the actual policies of these 2 empires in the late 19th century toward various peoples of East Central Europe, including the Ukrainians. I'll talk about distinctions and similarities between Russia and Germany, and then explain why and how Germany's tradition of empire ended in 1945, though Russia's continues, and then draw some conclusions and talk a bit about how these imperial forms have produced, in both cases, forms of genocide. Okay, it's not a very happy subject, but thanks for bearing with me. It does relate to this question of Ukraine. So I think what we've been witnessing in Ukraine in the last decade, so since 2014, is a full-out anti-imperial struggle of Ukraine, the sort that often precedes the robust formation of a nation state. Before 2014, outsiders, to some extent me included, often thought of Ukraine as part of post-Soviet space, inseparably connected by culture and political inclination to the old USSR and its major successor state, Russia. Yet since the Revolution of Dignity of 2014, which featured demonstrations in Kiev and many other places, millions of men, women, and children have been showing the world what it means to be Ukrainian. Above all, to insist on the free self-constitution of a polity, abiding by and enforcing the rule of law, respect for human rights, and the basic functions of democracy. If you take a global perspective, you see that similar struggles for national independence have taken place from the 1770s, beginning with the break of the 13 colonies from Britain, of Haiti from the French Empire, then of Brazil and other Latin American states from Portugal and Spain, the Portuguese and Spanish empires, of Serbia and Greece from the Ottoman Empire, early 19th century, and later in that century of Romania and Bulgaria, also from the Ottoman Empire. In the early 20th century, after World War I, and closer geographically to Ukraine, we see the emergence of constitutional order in nation states just across the border, in Poland and Czechoslovakia, both of which emerged as nation states from the ruins of empires in the fall of 1918. So In a sense, what Ukraine's struggle right now is about full membership in this club of independent nation states that have fought with and broken imperial rule, so the rule of empires. The Ukrainian struggle, of course, far predates 2014. There was a movement in favor of independence in 1917 with the collapse of the Russian Empire, which held on to statehood for several years before most of Ukraine was forcibly absorbed into the USSR. At the dissolution of the USSR, the Soviet Union in 1991, came clear expressions of the will of Ukrainians to be Ukraine, to be a nation state, of the will to live in and constitute their own independent polity. So a referendum was held in December of 1991, and over 92% of the adults in Ukraine expressed desire for independence. Ukraine's major neighbor to the north and to the east, Russia, however, did not respect and has not respected Ukraine's right to exist and recently subjected that country to extraordinary violence, as you're aware. Thus, beyond the contours of Ukraine's anti-imperial struggle, what we see more clearly after Russia's attack of 2 years ago than before 2014 is Ukraine's affinity to East Central Europe, to Serbia, Poland, Slovenia, Estonia, Czech Republic, Slovakia, a host of countries between Russia and Germany. Could you please forward the next slide? There'll be a blank. That's it. Thank you. East Central Europe. So these are places where even when established at various points in history, states have not been recognized or respected by imperial neighbors. Evident in recent years, that's in some ways, that's what holds East Central Europe as a region together. Evident in recent years, in other words, is that Ukraine has fully joined this region of small states who for centuries have had to contend against powerful neighbors for their simple existence. Anyone teaching courses on Eastern or East Central Europe, including myself in the future, cannot leave out Ukraine. We used to actually include it in Soviet space. Ukraine is clearly linked now with other small countries by this existential precariousness, other small countries between historic Germany and historic Russia. At a deep level, this precariousness, this precarious existence derives from an unusually invasive kind of imperialism projected by the two hegemonic powers, west and east of East Central Europe, that have controlled the region's destiny. Going back centuries, German and Russian states have shared a politically noxious, what I would call identity crisis. The pattern in other states in Europe, especially in the West, has been to develop within Europe as nation states, and in some cases then to expand overseas in empires. But the difference was always pretty clear. In Europe was the heartland, or in France, the metropole, and overseas was the empire. But Germany and Russia attempted to be both, nation and empire simultaneously in the same European space on the same territory. And this had disastrous consequences for the smaller peoples caught in the imperial penumbra, like Czechs, Slovenes, Latvians, Belarusians, or Ukrainians, many others, all who have lived within German or Russian empires. For Turkey in the old Ottoman Empire, the issue had been comparatively clear and was different. As Turkish nationalism arose in the early 20th century, there was little sense of areas of Ottoman imperial lands like Lebanon, North Africa, or the Balkans constituting vital parts of a Turkish national state. The matter was even more straightforward for the Blue Seas empires of Britain or France that I alluded to above, where imperial holdings were located at vast distances from the national core and usually consisted of ethnically and religiously diverse populations. During decolonization after World War II, places like Kenya, India, and even Algeria could be severed from British or French control without reducing or questioning the nation state in Europe. But the German and Russian states formed in huge spaces within Europe where the empires were not clearly distinguished from national core areas, and thus sought to shape the fortunes of colonial subjects caught within imperial boundaries, like Poles, Czechs, Latvians, Ukrainians, and many others. In ways that were more intrusive than in other empires, these peoples were slotted ultimately to become parts of the German and Russian nations, whether they wanted to or not, by assimilation if possible, by expulsion, or murder if not. The British historian Geoffrey Hosking described the Russian syndrome very well with reference to deep history. He noted the contrasting and competing concepts in the Russian imperial tradition of Rus and Rossiya. Next slide, please. Show you the spelling of these words. The former supposedly ethnic, connected to a sense of people and language. The latter, Rossiya, designating a great Russian empire. The imperial notion of Rossiya embracing limitless territory and people, however, has kept the former idea, Rus, the Russian core, from becoming a clearly defined nation state. Without this unfortunate overlapping of nation state and empire, Russian evolution, writes Hosking, would have been less unstable, polarized, and violent. Hosking quotes the Russian historian Georgy Gachev, who said the following: Rossiya is the fate of Rus. Rossiya is attraction, ideal, and service, but also abyss and perdition. Rossiya, the empire, uprooted the Russian people, enticed them away from Rus, that is, from their own land, transformed the peasant into a soldier, an organizer, a boss, but no longer a husbandman who could take care of his own land. Hosking devotes his book, this is his History of Russia, to explaining how the building of the Russian Empire impeded the formation of a normal Russian nation, a Russian nation state. My take on Germany is going to be a bit different from what you might expect. When historians discuss the problems of German imperialism, they tend to dwell on the colonial policies of Otto von Bismarck and his successors in the late 19th century. So next slide, please. They focus, let's make sure, is that coming through, the map of Africa?
Yeah, for some reason it's kind of flickering, but it
Yeah,
looks fine on my end.
Okay, so these are German possessions in Africa. So historians tend to focus on the impediments that this overseas imperialism, this gaining of territories in Africa and Asia, placed on Germany's development as a liberal democracy, with the major argument centered around what was called social imperialism, the supposed effort of Germany's conservative and right-wing establishment to cause the industrial proletariat, the increasingly numerous industrial proletariat of the late 19th century, to support an aggressive foreign policy focused on colonial holdings in Africa and Asia, thus distracting them from the injustice that they were enduring in Germany's class society. One terrible aspect of German colonialism, next slide, please, was the massacre of members of the Herero nation in the early years of the 20th century, amounting to about 100,000 dead. However, just please forward to the blank slide. It should be following. Thank you. But my critique of German imperialism looks to an older tradition, to an ancient German imperial entity, the Holy Roman Empire, and its power as an idea to frustrate the formation of a clearly defined German nation in the 19th century, much in the way that Rossiya, this Russian idea of empire, frustrated the formation of a Russian nation state. To refresh your memory, the Holy Roman Empire lasted from about the 9th century until its forcible dissolution by Napoleon Bonaparte in 1806. Next slide, please. When it emerged in the early Middle Ages, and for centuries afterward, this Holy Roman Empire was complex, not by any means a national state, not a clearly national state. It comprised numerous nationalities, some of whom I will name in a moment. But at the same time, and here comes this overlapping of characters, this complex and very large entity was considered to be Germany in a political sense. After the 14th century, it was referred to, and this is a fact not well known outside Germany itself, as the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, Heiliges Römisches Reich Deutscher Nation. So in the German mind, before 1806 and after 1806, so while the Reich existed, after it was dissolved, whatever Germany was considered to be coterminous with this huge empire in this huge space. The reason that Napoleon could so easily disband the Holy Roman Empire in 1806 was because it had no real central government. It had little tax collecting authority, hardly any military. Instead, the Holy Roman Empire consisted of hundreds of smaller and larger sovereign states that were loosely bound to each other. Some have said that it represented a predecessor in that sense to the European Union. Over time, two states within the empire, Austria and Prussia, became European powers of the first rank. And you see the Prussian blue at the top, growing Prussia, and this in the south is sort of, I guess it's like a brownish color representing Austrian lands. So Austria and Prussia became European powers of the first rank. They both belonged to the empire, and they survived the 1806 dissolution. They aided the European effort to defeat Napoleon, and Napoleon's final defeat, as you'll recall, occurred in Waterloo in Belgium in June of 1815. When modern politics emerged in Central Europe after this point, the German politicians, so in Central Europe, who wanted to unite the German lands, right now there was no longer an empire, and make a full German national state, the argument was that the Germans of Europe should have their own state, just as the Spaniards, the French, the Danish, or the English had theirs. These would-be makers of a first German national state could not and did not distinguish between a German core and very old imperial lands containing other nationalities. Now I'll mention a few of them. So some of the nationalities within this old empire were Danes, or many Danes. There were Dutch, what we would call Belgians, French, Italians, Slovenes, Poles, and all Czechs and Luxembourgers, all lived within the boundaries of the old empire. So whatever Germany would become, German politicians thought in the early 19th century, it would occupy at least the space of the old empire and perhaps more. Early in the year 1848, for the first and only time in history, the Germans of Central Europe, at that point men over the age of 25, living in the lands of the now defunct empire, voted for a national assembly which met from the spring of 1848 into 1849 in Frankfurt. Next slide, please. Actually, I think we need to see the slide after this. Sorry. Yeah, it's not. And next slide, please. Yeah, okay, that's it. So this is a representation from the time of the assembly in Frankfurt, the first German parliament. So whether politicians were left, right, or center, they assumed that Austria, Bohemia, Luxembourg, parts of today's Slovenia, today's Italy, Denmark, France, and the Netherlands would be included in the nation state they were creating. These lands, after all, had belonged to the old empire. Before I consider the consequences of what of this understanding, especially later in the century, I want to consider a question. Why should anyone be concerned with the formation of nation states in Europe? Why was the failure of Germany or Russia to become a proper nation state a problem? As you may know, especially since the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s, the breaking apart of Yugoslavia into smaller nation states, the nation state has fallen out of favor. Often citing Hannah Arendt, authors have noted, next slide, please. Authors have noted the deficiencies of the nation state, which seeks to make populations homogeneous and either forcibly assimilates or expels those who don't fit or don't seem to fit. For much of history, states were organized on other principles, imperial principles, monarchical principles. Nation states are thus not necessary to history, but, as some historians claim, contingent. Hannah Arendt's skepticism about nation states came precisely from the region that I've been talking about, the lands between Germany and Russia, including Ukraine. Of the new states created in East Central Europe after World War I, she wrote, the nation had conquered the state. National interest had priority over law long before Hitler could pronounce right what is good for the German people. So in a sense, the Czechoslovakia and the Poland that I mentioned to you, for Hannah Arendt, they represent the same national principle that Nazi Germany represented. She continues, here the language of the mob was only the language of public opinion, cleansed of hypocrisy and restraint. So she's saying that there's really no difference between what extremists were claiming of the mob, nationalist extremists, and the statesmen who actually built these nations states, who were mostly actually liberals and Democrats. So in fact, I argue that what the people and not the mob wanted when modern politics emerged in Central and Eastern Europe, beginning in the 1840s in the Czech lands, in Hungary, in Romania, in Poland, Slovenia, all these countries between Germany and Russia was exactly what the democratically elected German deputies wanted in 1848. Or indeed, populations in North America or France had wanted in the late 18th century. What they wanted was self-rule, popular sovereignty. They wanted democracy. So Czechs wanted to rule their own fate. They were expressing this increasingly openly from 1848 onward until they got their own state in 1918. They wanted to rule their own fate as a people in their own land, and they understood their own land to be Bohemia, which is today's Czech Republic. A problem, admittedly, however, was that Czech Democrats who wanted Czechs to rule themselves claimed spaces that Germans felt and knew had been at the heart of their old empire. And therefore, German Democrats, even German socialists, believed that Bohemia belonged in Germany. So making nation states in a multinational region was beset with basic difficulties of drawing boundaries. Still, what the British historian I cited, Geoffrey Hosking, intuited and constitutes a general truth in and beyond the region of small nations that had lived long under German and Russian domination is that the nation state, for all its shortcomings, has served as a platform, in fact, the only platform for stable democratic order. The Stanford political scientist Francis Fukuyama has said that Ukrainian nationhood, this is an article of last year, Ukrainian nationhood mixes elements of Western civic with Eastern cultural nationalism while forming the political community, a political community, which is essential to liberal order in a nation state. He wrote as follows: national identity is malleable, and it can be shaped to reflect liberal aspirations and to instill a sense of community and purpose among a broad public. For proof of the abiding importance of national identity, look no further than the trouble Russia has run into in attacking Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin claimed that Ukraine did not have an identity separate from that of Russia, and that the country would collapse immediately once his invasion began. Instead, Ukraine has resisted Russia tenaciously, precisely because its citizens are loyal to the idea of an independent, liberal, democratic Ukraine and do not want to live in a corrupt dictatorship imposed from without. With their bravery, they have made clear that citizens are willing to die for liberal ideals, but only when those ideals are embedded in a country they can call their own. End of quote. In other words, in a nation state. Numerous authors, including Hannah Arendt, portray monarchical imperial orders as supposedly non-national frames for extending and protecting human rights. However, for small peoples like Ukrainians, Poles, Czechs, or Slovenes, foreign imperial orders did not constitute and have not constituted a country they can call their own. Perhaps Hannah Arendt did not appreciate the drive for basic rights of self-government among these peoples, the peoples of East Central Europe, because, and this is a controversial argument, she shared a perspective widespread among students of Central Europe, namely that of hegemonic and superior German culture, which considered Czechs or Slovenes so-called non-historical nations. Ukrainians are usually included in this group. This, by the way, this idea of non-historical nations is an idea going back to Friedrich Engels and to Hegel, according to whom only large national states like France, England, Germany, or Russia had the destiny and the right to exist on the stage of history. Thus, what seems a universal perspective of humanity in Arendt's work may really be the perspective of traditional German imperialism. Okay, that's a pretty strong criticism of her work. But I should mention that I spent 3 years as a student in Poland, and so my perspective is a bit different. Now, if we take a global perspective, we see that historically, nation empires, that is, states that combine this character of being empires and nation states, like Russia or Germany, are actually quite rare. I was thinking about this, and I could only come up with Japan as constituting one other prominent case. As you may know, Japan tried to expand into Korea, Taiwan, and parts of China in the early 20th century, and wanted to make these areas parts of its own national self. That is, Koreans or Taiwanese were supposed ultimately to become parts of the home people. But back to my focus on Russia and Germany, where their ambitions to be empires as well as nation states at the same time became fully evident in the 1880s, with the rise of nationalism and imperialism throughout Europe. Both Hohenzollern in Germany, the nation state created by Bismarck, and I think I have another slide here. You could. So this is actually Bismarck proclaiming the formation of the German nation state in Versailles in 1871. Bismarck at the center in white, the Prussian king to his left, the future German emperor to his left, standing above him. Next slide, please. And this is the state that was created in the center. So this is the state that grew out of the northern parts of the Holy Roman Empire, which one can call Imperial Germany or Hohenzollern Germany. So with the rise of nationalism and imperialism throughout Europe, both this Germany as well as Romanov Russia, so the Russia of the late 19th century, Imperial Russia, pursued vigorous policies of nationalizing imperial subjects in order to consolidate their existences as nation states. In Germany, that chiefly meant Germanizing Poles in what is now Western Poland. In the case of Russia, that meant Russianizing chiefly Ukrainians. The two states denied the rights of Poles or Ukrainians to learn their own languages and acted to suppress native forms of religion. There was a difference, however. Bismarck's Germany, though it used the old word Reich or empire to describe itself, was an evident failure. It was not an empire, coming nowhere near the size of the old Holy Roman Empire, and it was not even a complete nation state. When the so-called Imperial Germany was called into being in 1871, some between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 Germans were left out. I think I have a slide on this as well. Could you please move forward? Next slide, that's Romanov Russia. Okay, so these are Germans. If you see, I don't know if you can see my cursor here. There are Germans, obviously, within the boundaries of 1871 Germany, but there are many Germans to the east and to the south, especially in Austria and today's Czech Republic, Bohemia, that were left out. So these Germans, left out of Bismarck's Germany, lived primarily in the other German state of that period, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which ruled much of the space of the old Holy Roman Empire to the south. Next slide, please. So this is a map of the old Habsburg Empire or Austro-Hungarian Empire. The red sections indicate where Germans lived. So today's Austria and Bohemia. Austria-Hungary is recognized these days, it's celebrated, in fact, in some quarters as having had the virtue of not being nationalist. It permitted Czech, Slovene, and other national movements to flourish. However, the dominant German elites in that country looked upon state latitude toward nationalism with apprehension. They feared that Germans who lived in mixed areas with Slavs, for example, in today's Czech Republic or in Slovenia or in northern Italy, or further north in what is now southern Poland, that these Germans who lived intermixed with Slavs might themselves become Slavs. They might be Slavicized. That is, absorbed by people whom they viewed as being culturally inferior. And if you read the transcripts of the parliaments, it was a relatively democratic order in Austria-Hungary. If you read the transcripts of the parliaments in Vienna or Prague, you get a sense of the expectation among German elites that these Slavs had the destiny of ultimately becoming Germans. They would be absorbed into the supposedly higher culture. Whether on the left or on the right, German intellectuals felt that Czechs, Slovenes, or for that matter, Slovaks did not have the heft to make up their own national states. So the tolerance of Austria-Hungary toward nationalities that we know about from the 1890s and the years before World War I was really a truce, anticipating the absorption of Slavs into the German and also the Hungarian peoples. In retrospect, as you may know, some call Otto von Bismarck's empire a second Reich, second empire, despite the deficiencies I've mentioned. Perhaps I should say a word about the Third Reich, that supposed 1,000-year Reich that in fact existed only from 1933 to 1945. After 1938 and the absorption of Austria and parts of the Czech lands, that Third Reich, what we call the Third Reich, finally included the Austrian and Bohemian Germans who had been left out of Imperial Germany in 1871. And indeed, this Reich, what we call the Third Reich, enjoyed lots of support from ordinary Germans, left to right. Even a lot of socialists actually thought what Hitler did in 1938 by absorbing Austria, parts of Czechoslovakia, was a good thing. They felt that Hitler, by uniting all Germans, was finally creating a state in which Germans would have a home, all Germans, just as the French lived in France, the Spaniards in Spain, Danes in Denmark, etc. Germany would finally be a proper nation state in Europe. But Hitler's Third Reich also contained ultimately all Czechs, as well as many other Slavs, who then became subjected to policies of Germanization that were far more violent than Bismarck could have imagined, up to and including genocide. However, as you're aware, in the course of World War II, Hitler did not stop at the borders of the Old Reich with his expansion. What you may not know is he took the United States of America as one of his models. The United States of America was a nation state that never officially called itself an empire, but as we know, expanded across a continent, making a continent a nation state. So if the US went west in the 19th century, in the 20th century, Germany would go east. In his mind, Hitler was improving upon German history by continuing expansion of the Reich eastward, a movement, in his view, that had been interrupted in the Middle Ages in the 12th century. And he did his expanding eastward with reference to deep German history. Those who study World War II will be familiar with this, but others might be surprised to learn that the attack on the USSR, major German offensive, an offensive of Germany and its allies in June of 1941, was called Operation Barbarossa. Could you please forward the slides?
John, after the next slide, I'm going to try to reshare my screen to see if I can fix the flickering, but please feel free to move forward with your lecture.
Okay. Yeah, I don't see any flickering at the moment. Okay, so this is the original Barbarossa that the attack on the Soviet Union was named after. An emperor of the Holy Roman Empire of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, supposedly a man who drove German expansion toward the east. So what Hitler claimed that he was doing in 1941 was picking up on a movement of Germany to the east that had been interrupted in the 12th century. So I've been talking about relatively recent centuries, 19th and 20th century in my talk so far, but it's precisely in that deeper history, going back to the early modern period and further, that we find an important distinction that needs to be mentioned when we talk about the German and Russian imperial traditions. At a deep level, the German and Russian empires differed in one crucial way. While the Russian Empire was strictly centralized, the German Holy Empire from the 12th century, so after the time of Emperor Barbarossa, became more and more decentralized. In contrast to Russia, Germany became a place of very strong, distinct, self-ruling regions. As I mentioned above, by the 18th century, there were over 1,000 sovereign entities within the empire, some large, like Austria and Prussia, but some tiny, no larger than towns, cities, and sometimes even bishoprics, which, it should be mentioned, causes some people to see in this old Holy Roman Empire a model for federal organization, for cooperation among states, as we see in the European Union. But the Russian and German traditions also have some important similarities, which are worth noting. In both, we see a pervasive and long-lasting sense of threat and weakness, which are unusual for empires. In Germany, the tendency is more evident because it was so decentralized. The Reich, the empire, came under foreign pressure from an early point and could not guarantee security against foreign invasion. The most infamous cases of German lands being vulnerable and open to foreign depredation are the 30 Years' War of the early 17th century, and then the French Revolutionary Napoleonic Wars of the late 18th century and early 19th century. In the former, the 30 Years' War, 1 in 3 Germans lost their lives, often to roving hordes of foreign mercenaries that the weak state could not control. So I have some slides on this, if you wouldn't mind moving forward. Not further. Further, please. Yes, so this is a representation from the 30 Years' War of the destruction of the city of Magdeburg, which was so total that it gave rise to a verb, Magdeburgisieren, means complete destruction of a city. It took place in 1631. Next slide, please. This indicates foreign mercenaries simply hanging German men from a tree somewhere in southern Germany in the course of the 30 Years' War. Again, giving a sense that Germany had no protection because it had no strong state. Next slide, please. And this is the destruction of beautiful Heidelberg in 1689 by French forces, the complete destruction of the city, including the castle. Only one structure remained. It's the Hotel zum Ritter. If you ever go to Heidelberg, you can still see it. In fact, it's featured right here in the center of the photo. But you get a sense, this is a 19th century representation of what happened in Heidelberg in 1689 from the nationalist period, suggesting that the French had made victims out of Germans because, and especially German women and children, because there had been no state. So you can imagine in the 19th century, the strength of the will for Germany finally to have a proper state. Russia too, however, before its rise, so you could maybe fast forward to a blank screen if there is one. Thank you. Russia too, before its rise to imperial status, experienced centuries of foreign rule, mostly from the east, but also from the west. The central purpose of the early Russian state, Muscovy, indeed was to unite lands that had been under foreign rule and then to expand in search of elusive security. So the British historian Hosking describes the predicament as follows. The openness and extent of the terrain, extending down to the Black and Caspian Seas, generated a shifting pattern of temporary alliances and enmities, a constant and restless jostling for power, for the domination over and elimination of one's neighbor. Security was sought, but never attained, since, however far hegemony might be extended, there was always a farther border beyond, and with a further neighbor and a further potential enemy. Like a cumbersome and nervous amoeba, Muscovy expanded to fill the space it was able to dominate and was impelled into a perpetual dynamic of conquest, reversing the thrust of the Mongols of 3 centuries before. End of quote. It's important to note that in neither Germany nor Russia was there a national agenda to this early gathering of lands that commenced in the Middle Ages. But the cores, in both cases, were national from the start. That is, ethnically German, ethnically Russian. We do see differences in ultimate ambition. In Russia, the tendency was to expand without borders, or bordered only by great seas and mountain ranges. In Germany, however, the old empire had reached its basic form by the 16th century. Yet both expanded in ways that are clearly imperial, moving to embrace many different peoples. These were unusual cases in Europe as a whole. France and Spain and Denmark had minorities, but within Europe they did not rule over other nations. The British case was more complicated, as becoming Britain involved rule over Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. But here 2 comments are in order. First, the success in assimilating these areas hinged on the ability of local elites to be involved not just in self-rule, according to old Roman models of co-opting elites, but also in rule of a vast overseas empire. Thus, many Irish, Scots, and Welsh became British by acting as imperial co-rulers, for example, in India. Actually, my wife's family were Scots who went over in the 18th century to India. Second, as Britain has progressed as a nation state and democracy, it has reduced the imperial character of both the more proximate and more distant empires, implicitly recognizing that one cannot have self-determination for oneself, while at the same time determining other people's fates. In Germany and Russia, however, the idea and reality of empire have persisted into more recent times. A sense has lasted into the modern age that somehow these empires are part of the natural order of things. Reich was a constant in German discourse after the old empire's dissolution in 1806. And so the politicians who were elected by popular vote in 1848, as I mentioned, whether left or right, took for granted that a Reich had to return to Europe as the structure within which Germans would live, providing security, which they needed, welfare, and legitimate rule. 1848 was the first high point of German democracy. And when the revolutionaries drafted late in that year what was to be Germany's first constitution, they called it a Reichsverfassung, Constitution for the Reich. The word maintained its power, the word Reich, over the decades, because as you may know, 1848 was a failure. Ultimately, the kings returned to power in Berlin, Vienna, and other places. But in 1918, there was a second German democratic revolution, more successful. But once again, in 1918, 1919, German Democrats, whether centrist or left, or indeed on the right, insisted that Germany had to be called a Reich. So this may surprise you that what we call the Weimar Republic was officially called Deutsches Reich. And you could perhaps forward to another slide. I think I have a slide indicating this. Yeah, so this is a stamp. If you intended a talk that I gave 2022, I showed this image then, I believe, as well. Kind of a surprise, right? That this democratic order called itself an empire. But this Weimar Republic was a state that was even smaller than the incomplete nation state of Bismarck. So evidently, in the minds of many Germans, not an empire. So it was not what it called itself. And thus, enthusiasm spread across regions and classes in Germany when Hitler expanded Germany, as I mentioned above, in 1938, into what he called the Großdeutsches Reich, the Great German Empire, and what we call the Third Reich. The Russian tradition had a stronger sense of gradations of Russianness within the imperial state, which historians, oh my goodness, Yellow Jacket has joined me in my Dwinell office. So the Russian tradition had a stronger sense of gradations of Russianness within the imperial state, which historians sometimes divide into inner and outer empires. Russian culture and language were promoted and assumed to be the governing idiom everywhere across the huge empire. This was true also in the Soviet Union. But the outright Russification that emerged in the late 19th century, so from the 1880s onward, was reserved mostly for Slavic areas closer to the Russian core, for the Polish and especially Ukrainian and Belarusian inhabited lands of the Russian Empire. In terms of the elusive quality of political culture, what has made these two continental nation empires, Germany and Russia, so intrusive and dangerous, in my view, is that the imperial peoples, that is, average Germans and Russians, unthinkingly and unquestioningly have shared this sense of their nations existing and needing to exist in huge imperial states when these huge imperial spaces were in fact multinational. Germans and Russians had inherited this sense from the deep past, and each generation reconfirmed its validity. It took the catastrophe of 1945 to end Germany's time as a Reich and the power of this idea. The destruction of that very word, indeed, was among the Allied war goals. In April 1945, Franklin Roosevelt produced a memorandum for his Joint Chiefs of Staff with the following communication. As long as the word Reich exists in Germany as expressing nationhood, it will forever be associated with the present form of nationhood. If we admit that, we must seek to eliminate the very word Reich and all that it stands for today. So Germany, after World War II, as you know, was divided first in four and then in two, in East and West, was no longer even a nation state. And it also lost about a fourth of its territories in the East. 12 million Germans were expelled from areas of the old empire and had no hope of ever returning. The Allies, by the way, also destroyed the state of Russia. They declared it defunct, null and void. What happened in World War II was thus not just military defeat, but annihilation of the most sacred word in German politics, breaking a tradition of over a millennium. Looking more positively at this event, one can speculate that Germany could only become a democracy after surrendering the idea of Reich, the belief that Germany was destined to rule over other peoples. Unfortunately for Russian historical memory, that is the way Russians think about their history, one of the major forces in producing the death of German imperialism, of that old Reich, was the old Soviet Union, the USSR, whose martial glories are kept alive in today's Russian Empire, Russian Federation, technically speaking. That is, the Soviet Union's role in destroying the German Reich is actively used to bolster claims to legitimacy of today's Russian Empire. So what makes the future, among other things, so difficult to contemplate is that in today's Russia, the elite's major claim, unshakable major claim to historical legitimacy, is precisely that Russia, as an empire, in the guise of the USSR, played a leading role in destroying that other continental empire. So I have two thoughts in conclusion. First, history is indeed a reservoir for attempting to draw lessons. Very difficult to do, but it's worth trying. One conclusion one can draw by looking at the past century's history is that empires have been waning as anti-colonial liberation movements and nation states have arisen across the globe, beginning with a vengeance in World War I, with the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian, the German empires, the Ottoman Empire, and continuing through the century with the gradual waning of the French, British, and other empires. So how will Russians ultimately learn that there's nothing necessary, let alone wholly, in their imperial tradition? Failure of the aggression in Ukraine is one possible path. Second conclusion, from a slightly longer historical perspective, to return to my core concern of nation states versus empires, is that when the two are combined in a nation state that is supposed to be an empire, and an empire that is supposed to be a nation state, as happened in Germany and in Russia over a very long time, the results can trigger some of the worst crimes known to humankind. In fact, crimes of an unprecedented nature, because such a state tragically combines the expansive energies of an empire with the often very intolerant insistence on uniformity and allegiance of a nation state. In my view, the word genocide easily applies to policies of both Nazi Germany and today's Russia, because the point is indeed the intent to destroy nations, which is the definition of genocide. In this case, nations that fail to behave as the empire nation-state requires. And the method, as became evident when one watched the early months of the war, especially the tragedy in Bucha, also invoked some of the most extreme terminology we possess to describe the crushing of human rights by a state. So I'm thinking of a second word that came out of the Second World War. Genocide was one, right? Genocide is actually a word that emerged during the course of the Second World War. The word that I kept thinking of in the early weeks of the Russian aggression was the German word Vernichtungskrieg, war of annihilation. That was how the Nazis described their campaign in Eastern Europe, the goal of which was complete destruction of any person or people or structure, built or otherwise, legal or brick and mortar, standing in the way of complete control of territory by the German Reich. The word Vernichtungskrieg, war of annihilation, comes to mind with Bucha, with the continued shelling that we read of every day, Kharkiv and other places, comes to mind with photos of Russian troops occupying villages and towns that have been wiped from the face of the earth, which you can see in pictures in the New York Times. I think in the weeks and months in which the US is reconsidering its commitment to Ukraine and Ukraine's struggle for what we as Americans gained from the struggle of our ancestors in the 1780s, I think only one thing is safe to say, and that is that the future is watching us.